Hey guys, welcome back to a brand new reaction video. Today we're reacting to the strangest legal defenses that worked by the one, the only legal eagle, the one and only. Action.
You've
Play.
probably heard about some of these bizarre legal defenses. The Twinkie Defense. What could that possibly mean? Or if you've been on Reddit, you might have engaged in a thought experiment about what would happen if one of two identical twins committed a murder. They look exactly the same as their twin, and they share the same DNA. Well, the thing is, these legal defenses have actually been made, and some were actually successful. Well, sort of successful. It depends on who you ask. Look, the law is complicated. I don't know what to tell you, but So stop me if you've heard this one. DMX, the rapper, plays one of his songs in court and receives a reduced sentence. Well, this actually happened. In April of 2021, the world lost Earl Simmons, better known as the stage name DMX. A successful rapper, songwriter, and actor, DMX undoubtedly had tremendous impact on music and pop culture. But as often the case for entertainers, with fame and fortune follows addiction and a litany of legal troubles. And since 1986, DMX has been jailed 30 times for a variety of offenses, including robbery, assault, carjacking, drug possession, pretending to be a federal agent, and tax evasion. But the reason we are talking about DMX today is for the unique defense offered by X's attorneys at his sentencing hearing for his tax case. And in what sounds like a contrived plot to an 80s movie no one actually saw, the day was saved in part thanks to the power of hip-hop.
It's true, I got the bars like candy, but spitting bars like me will get you all up in the Grammys.
No, not like that. Definitely not like that. But in July of 2017, federal prosecutors charged DMX with 14 counts of tax fraud. The government alleged that DMX owed $1.7 million in unpaid taxes from income earned between 2002 and 2005, and had failed to file taxes from 2010 to 2015, where DMX had made at least $2.3 million. Pro tip, not legal advice: always file your taxes, especially for a 5-year period where you're making millions of dollars. But in November of 2017, DMX changed his plea to guilty, and prior to sentencing, prosecutors were seeking the maximum penalty for 5 years in prison. So enter the father-daughter legal team of Murray Richmond and Stacy Richmond, who decided to try a novel music-based strategy to convince U.S. District Judge Jed Rakoff to be lenient. At DMX's sentencing hearing, Murray Richmond argued that his client suffered a nightmarish childhood, which had led to repeated encounters with the law at an early age and set him on a bad path as an adult. To illustrate his point, Murray requested that Judge Rakoff watch his client's music video for DMX's hit song, Slippin', that lyrically describes his traumatic upbringing. Growing up, DMX was abandoned by his father, lived in extreme poverty, endured severe psychological and physical abuse from his mother and her boyfriends, who knocked out DMX's teeth and left prominent scars on his face as a young boy, and then was introduced to drugs at 14 years old. Murray argued that watching this video would show how DMX was not a bad person, just that his difficult upbringing meant he was simply not prepared for the responsibility of having lots of money. The judge agreed to watch the video, and after listening to the song, Judge Rakoff remarked that in the eyes of the court, DMX was a good man, noting, quote, "In many ways, he's his own worst enemy." Judge Rakoff then gave DMX a reduced sentence for 1 year in prison and ordered him to pay $2.3 million in back taxes. After sentencing, DMX's co-counsel, Stacy Richmond, explained the rationale for playing Slippin' for the court.
This was about the humanity of one person reaching out to everyone else. And it's not about getting a pass, it's about getting a path.
And after learning about this case, I'm gonna have to talk to my clients about their bizarre lack of hit songs to support their cases. I mean, I can't do all the work for you. But that brings us to the Twinkie Defense, which is a very derisive term for a thing that actually happened, though it is incredibly misunderstood. The most common legal strategy for defending murder suspects is to deny all allegations and force the government to prove every factual element of their case. But when there is no dispute that the defendant committed the crime, defense counsel will often shift to the defendant's mental state to show why the defendant is not legally responsible for the crime and, at a minimum, deserves a less severe charge than first-degree murder. And such was the case with Dan White, a former San Francisco city supervisor who assassinated then Mayor George Moscone, and Supervisor Harvey Milk in a rampage at City Hall, turned himself into the police and then confessed to the crime.
Well, I'm definitely a law and order. I campaign very hard on what I consider to be the #1 priority, not only for my district, but for San Francisco, and that is to make this a safe city.
Now, this has been the subject of several movies, but here's the pertinent actual background. On January 8th, 1978, Harvey Milk became the first openly gay elected official in the history of California. A fervent advocate for gay rights, Milk's first official act on the board was to introduce a bill, which passed almost unanimously, outlawing discrimination based on sexual orientation in employment, housing, and public accommodations. Milk's famously brash brand of liberal politics frequently brought him into conflict with that of conservative fellow supervisor Dan White, a 32-year-old former police officer and firefighter. For example, White was the lone dissenting vote against Milk's non-discrimination ordinance. Tensions between the two began to reach a boiling point when Milk cast a deciding vote in favor of opening a halfway home in White's district for troubled adolescents. White stated that he felt betrayed by Milk, who had initially promised to oppose the halfway home and soon became disillusioned with the Board of Supervisors. 11 months into his tenure, White abruptly resigned from the board on November 10, 1978. White claimed that he could not support his family on a $9,600 salary and announced that he was leaving politics for good. 4 days later, in response to pressure from conservative-leaning police and business groups who feared that the mayor would appoint a replacement who would create a 6-5 liberal-conservative split, White sought to withdraw his resignation. Although Mayor Moscone initially agreed to give White his job back, the mayor changed course following an outpouring of outrage from White's constituents, who blasted him as ineffective and inattentive. On November 27, 1978, the mayor was set to appoint community activist Don Herenzi as supervisor. Angered that his plan to return to the board was thwarted, White then showed up at City Hall, slipped into a window to avoid metal detectors, and confronted the mayor at his office. When the mayor refused White's demand to be reappointed, White proceeded to shoot and kill the mayor execution style. He then walked down the hall and murdered Harvey Milk as well, murdering his former colleague. Both Moscone and Milk immediately died from their injuries. Soon, then acting Mayor Dianne Feinstein made the stunning announcement to the press.
Both Mayor Moscone and Supervisor Harvey Milk have been shot and killed. Oh, Jesus Christ! The suspect is Supervisor Dan White.
Later that day, White visited his former police precinct to turn himself in, then confessed to the killings in a recorded interview.
And then he started kind of smirking, because he knew I was going to be reported. And he just kind of smirked at me, as if to say, too bad. And then I just got all flushed and hot, and I shot him.
The assassination roiled the city of San Francisco, resulting in an outpouring of spontaneous support and mourning from the community. And at trial, the defense counsel for White argued that White's long-standing and untreated depression gave him what's called diminished capacity, such that he could not distinguish between right and wrong, and thus lacked the required intent to be found guilty of premeditated first-degree murder. Remember that the difference between first, second, and third-degree murder usually depends on the mental state of the accused. Dr. Martin Blinder, one of the 5 expert witnesses called by the defense, testified in the days leading up to the killings, White, known for being focused on personal health and fitness, cast aside his normal habits, grew stubble, and in lieu of his normal healthy diet, indulged in junk food. Blinder testified that White's excessive consumption of junk food, including Twinkies, which were only mentioned in passing, were evidence of his depressed state that had exacerbated his already existing depression. And the jury bought this diminished capacity defense, and White was convicted of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. He served 5 years in prison of a 7-year sentence. Less than 2 years later, White returned to San Francisco and committed suicide. Outrage after the verdict led to a series of violent events in San Francisco that would be known as the White Night Riots. And following intense negative publicity in 1982, California abolished the term diminished capacity as a legal defense and replaced it with something called diminished actuality. Under this new standard, evidence of mental illness is admissible to show a defendant lacked the specific intent to commit the specific crime in which they were charged, as opposed to the prior standard that could be used to show that the defendant lacks all capacity to have any specific intent to commit any crime. And as you can imagine, many people were upset about the outcome of the White trial, which is where the Twinkie defense name comes in. In stories covering the trial, San Francisco satirist Paul Krasner played up the angle of the Twinkie and claims that he may have even coined the term the Twinkie defense. Derisive reporters covering the trial seized on the testimony made in passing that White had eaten Twinkies in the days leading up to the murders, adopted the Twinkie defense framing, which led to decades of misunderstanding. And due to this misreporting in the press, much of the public erroneously believed that White's lawyers had argued that Twinkies drove White to commit the murder. In reality, White's lawyers argued that the junk food was a symptom of his diminished capacity, not the cause. But this misconception that White received a lesser charge by claiming junk food made him commit murder, which was repeated at the end of the 2008 biopic Milk, persists to this day. Nevertheless, the actual defense advanced was still controversial for successfully reducing White's charges from murder to manslaughter. Since then, some commentators have argued that the so-called Twinkie defense was less pivotal to White's defense than was the relatively conservative jury who possibly supported and sympathized with the former supervisor. It was reported at the time that when the jury listened to Dan White's recorded murder confession, several of them actually wept. And today, the term the Twinkie defense has become a derisive catch-all label for improbable legal defenses, like the ones that we're talking about in this video. And during the oral argument in the Supreme Court case of U.S. versus Gonzalez-Lopez, the late Justice Antonin Scalia famously referenced the Twinkie defense to suggest that the right to select one's own counsel is perhaps more important than the right to have effective assistance of counsel. The justice argued that, quote, "I don't want a competent lawyer, I want a lawyer to get me off. I want a lawyer to invent the Twinkie defense. I want to win." And now we know why lawyers get accused of being unethical. But now let's talk about one crazy legal hypothetical that you'd think you'd only cover in law school, but actually happened in real life. What happens when an identical twin commits murder? If, like me, you were raised on TV in the 1990s, then you know that the surefire formula to ensure wacky hijinks is to introduce twins into any situation, have them switch places, and then let the shenanigans unfold. Remember those classic episodes where Tia and Tamara switched places so they could take tests? Or Mary-Kate and Ashley switched places to get their parents together? And who can forget that time that Zach and Cody were arrested for drug trafficking in Malaysia, but narrowly escaped the death penalty when authorities couldn't tell them apart? Oh, wait a minute, that's my bad. That actually wasn't a special episode of The Sweet Life with Zach and Cody. That was a real case where twin-based shenanigans actually prevented brothers from being executed.
No way.
In 2003, Malaysian authorities arrested 27-year-old identical twins, Sathis Raj and Sabarish Raj, for trafficking large amounts of opium and cannabis, which in Malaysia carries a mandatory penalty of death by hanging. The police had caught one twin red-handed, taking a carload of drugs to another house, which only he had the key, and then shortly thereafter the other twin arrived and was promptly arrested. At trial, the judge acknowledged that the first brother who was arrested with the key was the only one with access to the drug house, and therefore was the only one the state could be able to prove was guilty of drug trafficking beyond a reasonable doubt. The problem? That due to the twins' identical features, it was impossible for the arresting officers to determine which twin had been initially arrested with a key to the drug house. So, further complicating the case, the twins refused to admit to any crimes, refused to testify against each other, and the DNA evidence was inconclusive. Unable to identify the twin originally arrested in possession of the drugs, the judge acquitted both men. In explaining her decision to acquit the brothers, High Court Judge Zahari Ibrahim noted, quote, "This is a very unique case as they are identical twins. Even the DNA evidence could not prove anything, as DNA could be either Sathis or Sabarish's. I can't be calling the wrong twin to enter his defense. I can't be sending the wrong person to the gallows." Or to explain this case using only Simpsons references,
"He can't kill anybody if he doesn't know which one's the real Krusty. Hup, ha, ha."
Now, I would like to tell you that this case is an outlier and that there isn't some identical twin exception to criming. Unfortunately, convicting individuals with identical twin siblings remains an ongoing dilemma for law enforcement. More often than you would think, suspects have been acquitted or have charges dropped when authorities can't prove which twin is guilty. One problem in these cases is that eyewitnesses who struggle to identify the twin that committed the actual crime. For example, in 2011, 19-year-old Orlando Nimbard was charged with shooting and killing a man outside of an Arizona nightclub. However, when evidence revealed that his twin brother Brandon was at the scene, prosecutors dropped the charges when the witnesses were unable to identify which brother pulled the trigger. So as you can imagine, reasonable doubt can be built right into these cases. This isn't a legal issue per se, it's an evidentiary issue. You have to prove your case beyond a reasonable doubt, and if you can't identify which twin it was, then you have a pretty uphill climb. Now this video isn't over yet. There is an extended version of this video over at Nebula, thanks to today's sponsor.
If you want to go watch over there, you can, but I will not watch. I'm a bit tired right now. I'll try to wake myself up real quick. See you guys in a bit. Peace out.